Betrayal doesn't always come with silence. Sometimes it comes with a sting so sharp, it leaves scars deeper than any wound. In today's story, we step into the life of Aliyah, a woman whose world shattered in a single evening when her husband, instead of standing beside her, chose to humiliate her before his entire family. What began as a moment of anger soon spiraled into something far darker, a storm of shame, heartbreak, and vengeance. But Aliyah wasn't the type to remain broken. Behind her, pain grew a fire, and behind her tears, a strength that no one expected. That night, everything seemed ordinary at first, though the air inside the house felt tense in ways Aliyah couldn't quite name. She had been married to Imran for 4 years, and she had grown used to the subtle power plays that existed within his family's home. Dinner gatherings were not uncommon, but the silence that followed her every movement always pressed on her nerves. Every step she took across the tiled floor echoed too loudly. Every plate she placed on the table seemed judged, and every word spoken by her was often dismissed as though she were an intruder instead of a wife. That evening, the tension was worse than usual. Imran's family was gathered in the living room, voices sharp, layered with conversations Aliyah wasn't meant to enter, and yet she was there, present but unwanted. She tried to focus on her tasks, making sure everyone had water, ensuring the food was warm, smiling faintly when spoken to, even though her heart was already heavy from days of Imran's cold behavior. He had been distant for weeks, brushing her off, raising his voice over the smallest mistakes, and looking at her with eyes that once held affection, but now brimmed with irritation. Aliyah knew something was wrong, but she never expected the night to unfold the way it did. Imran had been speaking to his elder brother when suddenly his tone rose. The conversation shifted toward her, though she hadn't realized it immediately. Words like failure and shame spilled into the air, sharp like knives, and only when Imran's finger pointed at her did Aliyah feel the room tilt. She froze, unsure why she was suddenly the subject of ridicule, yet too fearful to interrupt. His mother gave a small nod, his sister-in-law smirked faintly, and she understood at once. She was being cornered, made into the villain of a play she hadn't agreed to act in. The words escalated. He accused her of disrespect, of not knowing her place, of speaking when she should remain silent. Each word burned through her skin, and still she stood quietly, her fingers trembling as she clutched the corner of her dupatta. Then, in one moment that would replay in her memory forever, Imran's hand shot forward and struck her across the face. The crack of the slap cut through the room like thunder, and the sting radiated through her cheek, hot and humiliating. She stumbled slightly but did not fall. What hurt more than the pain was the silence that followed. The silence of everyone who had witnessed it. The silence of his family who said nothing, who simply sat there as though this act of violence was justified, deserved, perhaps even expected. Her eyes blurred, not just from the force of the hit, but from the tears that filled them, heavy and hot. She could taste the metallic tang of blood where her teeth had grazed her lip. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of disbelief and shame. Aliyah wanted to scream, to ask him why, to demand from his family at least one word of comfort or defense, but none came. The room was against her, the silence heavier than any word. Imran, on the other hand, stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with contempt rather than regret. Without another word, he stormed upstairs. The sound of drawers opening, hangers being yanked, and zippers dragging across fabric filled the air. He was packing. Each sound was louder than the last, echoing like a verdict against her. Aliyah stood frozen in the living room, her hand still pressed against her cheek, as the rest of the family watched in silence, some avoiding her eyes, others staring as though she had deserved the humiliation. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet refused to move. Minutes later, Imran descended the stairs, dragging his suitcase behind him. His movements were sharp, mechanical, as though he had rehearsed this act of abandonment. He did not look at her with love, nor did he look back with hesitation. Instead, he brushed past her, his shoulder hitting hers, leaving her standing like a shadow of herself. He opened the door with a swift motion, stepped outside, and with one final slam, the door closed, cutting off the man she had once called her husband. The echo of that door shutting reverberated in her soul. The house fell even quieter, though inside her mind a storm was beginning to rage. Aaliyah's heart raced, her breath came uneven, and her fingers clenched into fists she didn't even know she was forming. The humiliation, the pain, the betrayal, all of it burned into her veins. She could still feel the heat of the slap on her cheek, but more than that, she felt the burn of injustice, of being discarded like she was nothing in front of those who should have been witnesses to truth, but who chose instead to stay blind. Her world had shifted in a single night. The home she once believed could shelter her had become a prison of shame. The man she once trusted had turned into her executioner, and the family she once tried to belong to had shown her where their loyalty lay. In that silence, in that unbearable weight of disgrace, something inside her cracked. She was not going to forget this night, nor forgive it. The pain might have silenced her lips in that moment, but deep inside, a fire had begun to grow, one that would eventually consume every trace of the betrayal she had endured. The hours after Imran's departure stretched into an eternity for Aliyah. The walls of the house felt suffocating, heavy with judgmental stares and unspoken words. She stood rooted in the same spot long after the sound of the door slamming had faded, her body trembling not only from the sting of the slap, but from the humiliation of being abandoned so openly. The sight of his packed bags rolling behind him, the certainty in his stride as he left her without a shred of hesitation, replayed in her mind until it etched itself like a scar on her soul. It wasn't just a fight. It wasn't just a burst of anger. It was a deliberate act of rejection, a cruel performance staged in front of the very people who were supposed to be her extended family. Aliyah tried to gather herself, to steady her breathing, but when she glanced at the faces around her, the shame only deepened. His mother's lips were pursed, offering no sympathy, only silent approval of her son's actions. His brother avoided her gaze, fiddling with his phone as though nothing had happened. His sister-in-law leaned back on the couch, her smirk faint, but enough to cut through Aliyah like a blade. Not a single person had spoken up for her. Not one voice rose in protest when Imran struck her, or when he walked out with his belongings. In that silence, their allegiance was clear. They had chosen him over her, his pride over her dignity. Her knees weakened and she sank into the corner of the sofa, clutching the fabric of her dupatta to her chest, as though it could shield her from their eyes. Tears threatened to spill, but she bit her lip until the coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. She would not let them see her cry. Crying would make her appear weaker, more fragile than they already believed her to be. Yet inside, her chest ached, and her heart cracked under the weight of betrayal. She had always tried to prove herself to this family, to show them she was worthy of respect, of acceptance, but tonight proved that no matter what she did, she would always be the outsider, the unwanted one. The sound of Imran's suitcase wheels dragging across the pavement outside lingered in her ears, and with each second that passed, the reality sank deeper. He wasn't coming back, at least not tonight. He hadn't just left in anger. He had packed deliberately, methodically. He had prepared for this. The very thought made her stomach churn. For weeks he had grown distant, and she had excused his behavior, telling herself it was work stress, that he was tired, that maybe he just needed space. But the way he had walked out, without even a flicker of hesitation, revealed the truth. His decision had been made long before his hand struck her face. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside her soul there was a roar. Every second felt like another stone added to the weight on her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the lump in her throat kept her silent. She sat alone, replaying the moment again and again. The slap, the gasps, the silence, the suitcase, the slam of the door. Each detail carved deeper wounds. It wasn't just physical pain, though her cheek still burned. It was emotional devastation, the public humiliation of being discarded like she was nothing. Hours later, the house began to disperse, one by one retreating to their rooms as though the night had been nothing unusual. Aliyah remained where she was, staring at the door he had walked out of, her mind caught between disbelief and dawning realization. The quiet of the night mocked her, reminding her that she had been left alone, humiliated, and disgraced. The weight of abandonment pressed harder than the sting of the slap, because it wasn't only about the violence. It was about the choice he made to walk away, to leave her behind in front of the very people who would now whisper about her weakness. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly, as though she could comfort her own shattered spirit. The betrayal was fresh, raw, and overwhelming. But deep inside, beneath the layers of shock and grief, something darker was beginning to stir. She didn't know what form it would take yet, but she knew this. She would not forget the sight of him walking out with his bags, leaving her in ruins. She would not forgive the silence of those who had watched her suffer. This night, as unbearable as it was, had planted the seed of something that would soon grow beyond her pain. When the night's chaos settled, Aaliyah thought the worst was over, but she soon realized the aftermath cut deeper than the slap and the abandonment. The following morning, she woke with swollen eyes and a dull ache in her chest, yet she forced herself to step into the kitchen, hoping routine might help her breathe. But the moment she entered, the whispers started. Imran's sister-in-law, Shazia, leaned close to his mother, their hushed voices carrying just enough for Aaliyah to catch pieces of their words. "She deserved it," Shazia said with a grin tugging at her lips. Imran finally showed her place. His mother nodded slightly, not with pity for her, but with satisfaction. The realization hit Aaliyah like another blow. Not only had her husband struck and abandoned her, but his family stood behind him, applauding his cruelty in silence or justifying it with venomous words. Every look they gave her was a reminder that she was alone here. To them, she was an inconvenience, a burden dressed as a wife, someone unworthy of respect. The shame that had burned through her veins the night before now twisted into something heavier. Humiliation laced with betrayal. She had always tried to win them over, always softened her tone, adjusted her ways, cooked their favorite meals, and bent herself to fit the mold they demanded. And still, all it took was one public humiliation for them to show their true faces. As the day stretched on, the weight of their coldness grew unbearable. When she entered the living room, conversations halted abruptly. When she placed food on the table, no one thanked her. Instead, Shazia muttered under her breath, "At least now she knows her limits." The words stung more than the slap itself, echoing louder than the silence of the night before. Her heart twisted with grief. But beneath the grief, anger began to flicker, a slow, steady flame. Later that evening, she retreated to her room, her mind churning. Every expression she had seen, every whispered word, every dismissive glance played on a loop. She realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. They had always been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to fall, to break, to be put in her place. The betrayal wasn't just her husband's. It was the entire household's. She thought back to the small slights she had ignored, the moments where they excluded her, the sharp remarks she had swallowed in silence. She had convinced herself those wounds were minor, but tonight, they all stitched together into one glaring truth. They had never accepted her, never seen her as family, and now, they didn't even see her as human enough to deserve dignity. Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty wardrobe where Imran's clothes used to hang. The silence of the room pressed on her, a reminder of abandonment, yet the emptiness began to spark something unexpected in her. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of being alone. What she feared more was continuing to live surrounded by people who thrived on her pain. That thought hardened her resolve. She wouldn't cry before them, wouldn't beg them for acceptance. If they wanted to see her as weak, they would be proven wrong. But as she sat there, her mind restless, she couldn't help but wonder where Imran had gone. Was he staying with a friend? Or worse, was he already with someone else? The thought clawed at her insides. His sudden distance over the past weeks, his coldness, his irritability. Was it truly stress? Or had there been another betrayal hidden beneath it all? Aaliyah's heart pounded as suspicion seeped in. The slap, the humiliation, the walkout. It all seemed too orchestrated, too final, as if he had been preparing for this exit long before it happened. Her breath grew uneven as another realization took root. The family's silence, their approval, their indifference. It wasn't only loyalty to Imran, it was knowledge. They knew something she didn't. And their smirks, their whispers, their cold dismissal weren't just reactions to her humiliation. They were celebrations of a secret she had yet to uncover. That night, as the house fell quiet again, Aaliyah lay awake, her mind tangled in suspicion and fury. The betrayal she had endured was no longer just about a slap or abandonment. It was larger, uglier, and more dangerous than she had imagined, and though her body ached from the pain of yesterday, her soul had begun to transform. The seed of anger was sprouting, and with it, the beginnings of something she had never allowed herself to feel before: the hunger for revenge. The next days dragged on like a nightmare Aaliyah could not wake from, yet each hour only sharpened her awareness that the betrayal was not confined to humiliation or abandonment. It was something much darker. She began to notice small fragments of truth hidden in the family's words, careless slips of the tongue that revealed what they had tried to keep buried. Shazia, smug as ever, once whispered over the phone while standing near the hallway, "He's better off now. She was only in the way." Aaliyah froze at the words, her chest tightening. In the days that followed, she caught his mother making remarks about how peaceful the house finally felt without her constant presence. Every sentence dripped with disdain, and yet they all seemed to know something more, as if Imran's departure had not been a sudden explosion of anger, but part of a plan in which she had been the last to know. Her suspicion grew heavier when she went into the study to fetch some documents. On the desk, she noticed a piece of paper left half hidden beneath a file, a bank transaction slip. The amount was larger than anything Imran had ever moved before, and the date was just 2 days prior to the night he had slapped her. Her stomach twisted. Where had the money gone? Who was it for? She clutched the paper in trembling hands, realizing this wasn't an act of impulsive rage. It was preparation. Imran had been planning his departure, securing his escape, and she had been the fool left in the dark. Each detail she uncovered was another crack in the foundation of the life she thought she had: the nights of him staying late at work, the unexplained phone calls, the sudden coldness in his eyes. They were all signs she had ignored, convincing herself it was just stress, just life pressing down on him. Now she could see the truth unraveling before her. He had been orchestrating his betrayal, weaving lies while she clung desperately to hope. One evening, while passing by the guest room, she overheard his brother speaking on the phone. His words were low, but laced with certainty. "Imran will be fine. He's not coming back. She'll learn to live with it." The sentence sliced through her like a blade. Fine? Not coming back? It wasn't just temporary. He had left with finality, and his family knew it all along. They had sat in that living room, silent while she was slapped, silent when he packed his bags, because they had already been part of the script. Their silence had not been shock. It had been complicity. Aaliyah retreated to her room, the paper still in her hand, her mind spinning. The betrayal was deeper than she ever imagined. It wasn't just her husband's violence, not just his abandonment. It was a web of secrets that entangled his entire family, and she was the prey caught in the center. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the wild beat of her heart. For years she had given herself to this home, to these people, cooking their meals, respecting their traditions, bending her back to fit into their expectations, all while they waited patiently for the day she could be discarded. She looked into the mirror across from her bed, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red but fierce. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who had been slapped into silence. This woman was awake now, pulled from the fog of illusions she had lived in. The more she pieced together, the clearer it became. Her humiliation was never about a moment of anger. It was the opening act of a betrayal plotted long before that night. Her chest tightened as she thought of the money, the lies, the whispers. Imran had left her behind not out of rage, but out of choice. Perhaps for someone else. Perhaps for a life already prepared without her. And his family, the very people she had tried to call her own, had held the truth in their palms while watching her break. Aaliyah clenched her fists, her nails biting into her skin, the sting grounding her in the storm of fury building inside her. If they thought she would crumble, they were wrong. If they believed their silence would bury her, they underestimated the fire now alive in her veins. The truth, once hidden, had begun to unfold before her eyes, and with every revelation, her pain was twisting into something sharper, something dangerous. Aliyah's grief had reached its breaking point. And with it came a transformation she hadn't expected. Nights once filled with sobbing into her pillow now burned with restless thoughts. And each memory of that slap, that humiliation, became fuel for something far stronger than despair. The betrayal had carved her open, but inside the wound, she found a fire she could no longer extinguish. Her silence had protected Imran and his family for too long. Now, her silence would become her weapon, a cover under which she would plan every step, every move toward reclaiming the dignity they had stolen from her. She began to watch, to listen more carefully than ever before. The very family that mocked her presence, that believed she was broken, never noticed the way she lingered in corners, the way her ears caught fragments of their conversations, the way her eyes followed every detail they overlooked. Shazia, arrogant in her malice, often bragged on late-night phone calls about Imran's freedom and the way things had fallen into place. His mother whispered prayers for his new life, words laced with knowledge of secrets Aliyah had yet to uncover. They thought she was fragile, drowning in heartbreak, but in reality, she was piecing together the very puzzle they had tried to hide. The bank slip she had found became her starting point. She kept it hidden beneath her mattress, pulling it out in the dead of night to stare at the numbers, memorizing every detail. That transaction meant something. It was proof that Imran's exit had been calculated. It gave her direction, a clue to follow. And though she didn't yet know where it led, she knew it was the thread she would pull until the entire fabric of their lies unraveled. Her planning didn't come with loud declarations or threats. It came in the form of patience, of masking her rage behind quiet compliance. She began to move like an actress in their play, obedient, silent, seemingly broken, while underneath, her mind worked tirelessly. Every whispered insult, every cruel glance only hardened her resolve. She realized something important. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her silence for surrender. That mistake would be their downfall. One night, as she sat alone in her room, the echoes of laughter from the family drifting down the hall, she stared at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back no longer resembled the one who had been slapped into silence. This woman's eyes burned with determination, her lips pressed into a thin line of resolve. She whispered softly to herself, "They thought they ended me. They've only created someone they'll regret." The words steadied her, grounding her in her purpose. Her heart still ached. Her nights still carried shadows of pain. But woven into that pain was a clarity she had never felt before. Revenge wasn't about a single act. It was about strategy, about letting the truth unravel at the perfect moment. She wouldn't simply lash out in anger. That would make her no different than Imran. No, her revenge would be colder, sharper. It would strike where they least expected, in ways they couldn't defend against. She began documenting everything. Subtle things she noticed, pieces of evidence left carelessly around the house, even her own recollections of what had happened that night. She wrote it all down, knowing that one day these details would matter. Each note she penned wasn't just a memory, it was ammunition. And though the family saw her as defeated, she was quietly building an arsenal of truth and strategy. The shame they had forced on her, the isolation they had trapped her in, no longer weakened her. Instead, it strengthened the fire within. She could feel herself changing, molding into someone sharper, someone unrecognizable even to herself. Aliyah was no longer the woman desperate to be accepted by them. She was becoming the woman who would stand above them, watching as they crumbled under the weight of the very cruelty they had once inflicted on her. Every breath she took now carried purpose. Every silent step she made was a rehearsal for the storm she was preparing to unleash. She didn't know exactly how the end would look, but she knew this. When the time came, her revenge would not just be about retribution. It would be about reclaiming her power, her dignity, and making sure that the night Imran slapped her in front of his family would be remembered not as her humiliation, but as the spark that ignited their downfall. The months that followed were quiet on the surface, but volcanic beneath. Aliyah moved through the house like a shadow with purpose, each small action measured, each smile a mask that hid the storm within. She continued her careful documentation, turned the bank slip into a thread leading to other threads, and every evening she stitched those threads into a pattern she could read. She learned to speak softly at family gatherings, to laugh at the right moments, to let them believe she was still the fragile figure they'd expected. All the while she gathered proofs, phone numbers, receipts slipped into the bottom of drawers, a string of messages that painted a picture none of them suspected she could see. People who had once dismissed her began to hand her secrets on a platter, certain she wouldn't know what to do with them. They were wrong. When the first piece fell into place, she moved without drama. Aliyah sent a single message, not to Imran, but to someone whose life would be upended by what she planned to reveal. A journalist who had once covered local scandals and had an appetite for truth. She attached a photo of the bank slip and a short clinical note. Dates, amounts, names. No pleas, no rhetoric, only facts. The journalist's reply came with a polite question about authenticity. She answered with the receipt she'd photocopied, the whispered recordings she'd captured of Shazia and the brother celebrating Imran's freedom. A ledger she'd found tucked among documents in the study. She handed the story over like a controlled flame, careful to place it where it would burn cleanly and expose, not destroy. On the day the article went live, the household began to unravel. The headline was merciless in its clarity, and the first shockwave hit Imran before the family could react. The bank transfer wasn't a lonely slip. It was a trail to a small business Imran's brother had ties with, a receipt for a ring purchased in cash for someone who was not Aliyah. The journalist's piece was thorough, quoting the documents, the dates, the photographs of the evidence. It described the hush that had fallen over the family the night Aliyah was slapped, and how that hush had been rewarded with secrets kept between them. The city buzzed. Neighbors whispered. People who once averted their gaze now looked at her with curiosity rather than contempt. Imran returned to the house within days, but not as the triumphant man who'd once slammed the door. He came back with explanations ready, but they were brittle against the weight of hard proof. His denials sounded like rehearsed lines, and some of them were. The community that had sat in silence the night of the slap now demanded answers. Questions that had been crushed under politeness were suddenly asked aloud. The family had to answer to acquaintances, to vendors they owed favors to faces that had once smiled and now asked pointedly why they had watched a woman be humiliated. The ledger that named them was the key, and Aliyah had turned it with steady hands. But public exposure was only part of her plan. She had not wanted revenge to be mere spectacle. It had to be reclamation. She insisted on meeting with Imran alone, not to plead or to beg, but to speak with the calm accuracy of someone who'd done her homework. In the small room where they had once promised futures to each other, Aliyah laid out the evidence, the money, the messages, the whispers recorded in the dark. She watched him flinch when confronted with the ledger that listed purchases none of his stories could explain. He tried to bargain, to shift blame, to make it sound like a mistake. Each excuse collapsed under the quiet facts she presented. She felt no triumph in his shame, only the steady pulse of truth reclaiming its place. When the family gathered that evening, it was not with the smug arrogance they'd worn before. The mother's lips trembled when others used Imran's name in questions that weren't kind. Shazia avoided Aliyah's gaze, and the brother now kept his responses clipped. Their social circles shifted imperceptibly. Invitations dwindled. People are kinder to winners and crueler to the fallen, and Aliyah had chosen a path that placed her outside both categories. She did not seek their ruin for cruelty's sake. She wanted the dignity they'd stripped from her returned. Not as restitution, but as the acknowledgement that she had never been less than anyone in that room. The final blow was not a public spectacle, but an act of quiet justice. Aliyah filed for separation, not in haste, but with documents prepared, each line supported by the facts she'd collected. The court proceedings were clinical, factual, and the ledger was presented like a clean witness. Imran's attempts to paint her as vengeful floundered when faced with the paper trail she'd built. The judge read the evidence plainly. It was not melodrama, but proof, and it spoke louder than any performance of grief or regret. The settlement ensured Aliyah left with enough to build a life she had once been told she didn't deserve. It wasn't about money alone. It was about the explicit recognition that his actions and their family's complicity had consequences. On the day she gathered her things, there was no dramatic scene of triumph or vengeance. No shouting, no vindictive celebration. She stood in the doorway of the house that had been both shelter and cage, glanced once at the faces that had watched her fall, and felt something she had not expected. A serene, hard peace. The sting of the slap remained in memory, but it no longer defined her. She had turned humiliation into resolve, abandonment into strategy, and the silence of onlookers into the chorus that exposed the truth. As Alia stepped out into the daylight, the past folded quietly behind her. The neighbors' whispers would last a while, but so would the changes she'd set in motion. She walked away not to revel in their downfall, but to reclaim the space in which she could breathe and become whole again. Whatever future lay ahead, she had earned it with patience, clarity, and a courage that began as wounded love and ended as a force for her own dignity.